What is the creepiest true story someone has ever told you? Story 1. Okay, this is gonna get buried, but this is a legit creepy story involving a jar of hearts. My high school teacher told us a story about his friend living in rural Arkansas. The friend, meets a girl at the Walmart register. They talk and hit it off pretty well. She is a nice, religious girl, exactly like the one he wanted to be with. They exchange numbers, he calls, they have long conversations deep into the night, they go on dates. She is a genuinely nice girl. She ended every phone conversation with a prayer. "We thank your father," or something like that. The guy is completely smitten. She finally calls him to come to her house at 7:30 one Saturday night. She tells him to come there at exactly 7:30 and not a minute later. She says that if he is even a minute late, she will break up with him. The guy was a Little League baseball coach and had a game on that day. The game was supposed to end a few hours before that, so he accepted the offer. On the day of the game went into overtime, or whatever you call it in baseball. It went on longer than expected. The dude, coach, was getting a little nervous, but he still had plenty of time. The game ended a little late, but 3 of the kids' parents hadn't arrived yet, and he had to drop them off at home. Panicking. He really doesn't want to miss his chance with the nice girl. He tells them to hop into the car and speeds off. After quickly dropping off the first 2 kids, he decides the 3rd kid's house is too far off, so he leaves him on the road and begs him to go walk home. Yeah, very douche move, I know. He rushes home, showers, gets dressed in a hurry, and tries to go to the girl's home ASAP. He arrives at her house at 7:35, 5 minutes late. A woman in her mid-40s comes out and tells him Clarice, the nice girl who called him over, said you are late and wants you to go away. Leave. Dejected, he goes back home. A few days, or rather, the next day, I think. Later, he sees the local news. He sees the house and it looks familiar. It's the girl's house. The police are leading a handcuffed woman out of the house. It is the 40-year-old woman that had spoken to him earlier. Behind her is the girl he was dating. He was shocked as the headline read child kidnappers, or something like that. He expected the police to visit him soon as well, because he was dating the girl. Soon, as expected, a police officer comes to his house and asks him if he is him. The guy is nervous, but knows his rights. He asks if he should get a lawyer or not. The policeman tells him that he is not legally allowed to tell him what happened, but felt a moral obligation. This is where the story gets creepy. The policeman says the women arrested were engaging in human sacrifice. In their house, they found the missing children's remains. There was blood all over the walls and jars of hearts labeled with the names of the missing kids. There was an empty jar that had the dude's name on it. Turns out the girl invited him on a date at her house at 7:30 to kill him in a ritual human sacrifice. The ritual, apparently, had to be executed with precise timing. His being late saved him from being ritually sacrificed. Needless to say, there are some crazy cults in rural Arkansas. Well, that's one way to dodge a bullet. Or should I say dodge a sacrificial knife? Yikes, this story is giving me goosebumps. Who knew a jar of hearts could be so creepy? And to think the guy was just trying to go on a date with a nice religious girl from Walmart. Talk about a bad first impression. Looks like it's time to steer clear of rural Arkansas. Or at least be extra careful on your first dates. Story 2. Alright, I can chime in on this thread. About a year and a half ago, my best friend of 15 plus years and I took a trip out to my family farm at night after getting out of our second shift job. It was a nice, clear, crisp, early fall night in Michigan. We were sitting there just chit-chatting away and watching the night sky when he asked a very peculiar question. He said, "This place has always had a strange feel to it, almost like you're being watched. Did something happen here? Something bad, I mean." I just laughed a little, and I replied that I only knew the stories that my father told me. I told him about how when my great-grandpa purchased the farm in the early 30s, that it was a big family project to keep it up and running. Relatives would come and help with the chores, and in exchange, be able to hunt the land for food. My great-grandpa had a cousin that came over one day, helped out, and asked if he could go out later that night to do some raccoon hunting. He, of course, got permission and set out shortly after sundown. The next morning, my great-grandpa noticed that his vehicle was still out in the driveway, even though he should have left hours before. It was still dark out, but my great-grandpa knew that they were off the land he would be hunting, and set off in that direction. He walked back towards the back pasture field, and he came around a bend. He hollered my cousin's name. He heard a strange, yet familiar voice answer him back. He said that the voice chilled him to the bone. Something wasn't quite right about it. So he called out again, and this time, the voice was for sure not his cousin's, but almost like a growl, imitating his voice. He said he hightailed it out of there, never looking back. When the sun came up, he took a big group of relatives and farmhands to look for him. They found his gun, loaded but not fired, his hat, which was covered in a brown liquid spattering, and that was all. My great-grandpa looked for any signs of him for over 60 plus years. The only time he ever held out hope of finding him, my dad said, was when the swamp and the pasture fields by where he was supposed to be hunting dried up. Needless to say, there's more to this story, but as I've already written quite a long post, I will leave this as it is for now. If you want to hear more, let me know. And I'll post the rest of the strange events that have happened on my family farm. I mean, who doesn't love a good tale of a mysterious disappearance on a family farm? Am I right? But seriously, this is giving me the creeps. That growling voice and the brown liquid spattering in the cousin's hat. It's like something out of a horror movie. I'm curious about what else has happened on this farm. Are we talking about more ghostly sightings, strange noises, or maybe even some crop circles? I guess we'll have to wait and see if our storyteller decides to share. Story 3. One night, he was woken up by one of these noises, so he walked from his room to the kitchen to get a drink of water to try and set his head straight. When he came around the corner, he swears he saw his mother standing at the stove, cooking something, and he said you could smell it. The ghost of his mom, or her apparition, or whatever, turned around and looked at him and smiled. He started to back away, and he wanted to scream and run, but he just couldn't bring himself to do that. The ghost walked out their back door onto their deck and beckoned for him to follow. He did. The ghost walked out to their back garden, back to where his mother was found. He stood there and just watched it for a few minutes. The ghost stood on the exact spot for about 10 minutes, and this whole time, my friend was being quiet and trying not to poop his pants. Eventually, this apparition went away. My friend stuck around for a few minutes just to be safe. Afterwards, he went back inside and tried to fall back asleep. The next morning, he just thought he had a bad nightmare. He went outside to the spot in the garden where the ghost had been. His mother had died. And on the exact spot where the ghost had stood for that 10 minutes was growing a group of about 5 roses. One for each member of their family, he claims. My friend, his sister, his older brother, their father, and one for the dog. I, at first, didn't believe him. That is, until he sent me a picture of the group of roses surrounded by all the dead plants. I wish I still had the picture, but this ordeal took place almost half a year ago. Still gives me chills when I think about it. I can't even begin to imagine what it's like for him. It's especially eerie that the ghost looked like his friend's mother, and even smelled like she was cooking something. It's understandable that your friend was terrified and didn't know what to do in that situation. The fact that the ghost led him to the exact spot where his mother has died, and where the roses were growing, is also very intriguing. No matter what happens, that story will stay with him for a long time. Story 4. Hope this doesn't get buried. This happened to my parents about 20 years ago now. Both of them were driving out to Death Valley to a hotel for a weekend in the wintertime, and they had left late in the day and were going to arrive at the hotel at night. The hotel was about 30 minutes outside of the actual Death Valley town center, and when they finally found the place, it was completely abandoned. My mom gets spooked easily and didn't want to go and look, but my dad's into that sort of stuff and got out of the car. Right after he walks around the back of the building to look around, a man approaches my mother's side of the car. He claims his motorcycle broke down and that he delivers newspapers to Death Valley. My mom looks around, sees no motorcycle anywhere, and this hotel has nothing near it, not one building. This guy was begging my mom to come get the newspapers and take them to a hotel in town. Otherwise, he'd lose his job. He had the stack in his hands and wanted her to open the door so that he could give them to her. My mom's getting serious vibes from this guy now and refuses, locks all the doors and tells him to go away. He continues to beg. Finally, my dad comes around the corner and the guy panics a bit and just hands them over to my dad quickly and leaves. They drive off and they spot the guy walking off into the desert. They finally get to the hotel to deliver the papers and end up booking a room there. When they hand over the newspapers, the lady at the desk tells them they don't get any newspapers delivered to the hotel. My parents open up the stack and look at the front page. It's a newspaper from 1954. Story 5. My 4-year-old daughter was supposedly asleep when I heard noise coming from her upstairs bedroom. I tried to listen, but could not make out what was being said. I approached the room, and she stopped talking. Thinking I alarmed her, I went into the room. At that time, she was sharing it with her 3-year-old sister. I walked in and saw the 4-year-old sitting up in bed. I smiled and said, "Is everything okay?" She said fine, but her sister said they were keeping her up. I asked who. My 4-year-old said sorry, but that she was talking. When I asked her who she was talking to, my 3-year-old sat up and said, "The girl in the window. She said you were coming." After I shit a brick, I asked who the girl was, and they both said a girl comes and stands in front of the window at night and talks to them. Not knowing what to say, I said, "Okay," tucked them in, and hung around outside their door. The next day I asked about the girl. They said she came back but was mad. I waited a few days and asked again. My 4-year-old said the girl in the window was still mad. I forgot about it for a week when my wife said, "Who are the girls upstairs?" Freaked out, I ran upstairs and both girls were sitting under the window looking up. They turned and looked at me and asked if I wanted to meet the girl. When they turned around, disappointed, they said the girl left. It has been about 5 years since, and I have not heard about the girl in the window since then. It's interesting that the girls both saw and spoke with the girl in the window, and that she seemed to have emotions and reactions. I can only imagine how you must have felt when your wife asked about the girls upstairs. Have you ever done any research on the history of the house or the area? It's possible that there could be some explanation for the ghostly girl. Story 6. Up until I was about 6 or 7, I kept having strange dreams. It was kind of like a TV show. I'd watch this woman's life play out in a series of events. I didn't even know who the lady was I kept seeing in my dreams. Most of it was random stories, like her coming home from work one day to find out her oldest daughter had locked her sister out of the house, naked. I had dreams of watching this woman beat her children. I watched this woman and her boyfriend get into drugs. I watched them shoot up heroin before I even knew what it was. I even watched this woman die of AIDS in a hospital bed. None of it made sense to me until I even watched this woman's funeral. The last dream I ever had was the boyfriend rape the oldest daughter. Throughout that entire horrific scene, I could hear the woman's voice. "Tell her I'm sorry. Please, Vanessa, tell her I'm sorry. I should have listened." At this point, I woke up majorly panicked, not just from what I had seen, but because this woman called out to me by name. So I finally go to my mom, and I'm talking so fast, trying to get it all out, and my mom is just standing there with her jaw to the floor as I'm recalling my dreams and her childhood memories. When I got to the apology, she started to sob uncontrollably. I want to note that my mother never told me anything about my grandma or her childhood prior to these dreams. I'd never even seen a photograph of her. Story 7. I live near a camp that I used to attend as a child. When I was 7, there was a counselor at the camp who's Russian. The camp has a very large staff exchange program with many different countries, and was very weird at that. Counselors said he was incredibly fast, and during staff-only campfires, he would catch, skin, and eat live rabbits. He could do this crazy sleep or hold move. It essentially was a strangling move that knocked you out for a few seconds. You came to, and were fine a minute later. I saw him do it on a counselor once. The guy was out for about 10 seconds. He was forbidden to do it after that. However, the kids got curious and started asking him to do the move. He would do it in secret, but he would increase the severity of his holds, which would in turn keep the kid knocked out for a longer period of time. One day, a camper went missing. He wasn't in his bunk, despite going to bed with his cabin that night. They did a camp-wide search, keeping us all on the soccer field for about 2 hours. The counselors had to start searching the water. They found his body under the sailing dock, completely out cold. He was alive, but very unconscious. He had strangle marks around his neck. Everyone knew who it was. They arrested the Russian guy and deported him back to Russia. Turns out they never even sent an exchange counselor. Nobody knew who he was. This is such a tragic and disturbing story. It's frightening to think that someone who was supposed to be a counselor and role model for children could be capable of such terrible things. What frustrates me even more is that he was deported back to Russia instead of facing justice in the country where he committed such a heinous crime. Story 8. 10 years ago, about 2 years after my mother had died, my dad was getting remarried. Before my stepmom was going to officially move in, we had to clean out a lot of the house because we were consolidating 2 families worth of stuff. One morning, while we were cleaning, my babysitter and I found a fancy mug of my mother's with the emblem of her college and accidentally left it in the upstairs office. My dad came home from work a few hours later and suddenly the mug was downstairs in the kitchen on top of a sample of the wedding invitations. No one had touched it since the morning. We joked about the haunted mug for a while, how it was my mom giving her approval of the wedding. Nothing happened again for a bit until a little over a year after they were married. My stepmom had misplaced her car keys and spent half an hour searching every corner of the kitchen for them, which involved many laps around the island counter, which had been scoured thoroughly. However, on what must have been the 50th lap around, she saw that her keys had appeared on one of the corners with the mug next to them. We put it on a high shelf, and it hasn't moved since. Story 9. I have a story to share. This is not something that happened to a friend's friend. It happened directly to me. When I was young, I was intrigued by the paranormal, as I suppose everyone was. I outgrew it, of course, and unfortunately. Once in summer, I was probably 17 years old. Me and some friends were hanging out on the beach at night with some 14-year-olds, maybe younger, who felt like sharing scary stories. I had outgrew the phase. I was so bored, so I just kept saying stupid stuff all night, provoking spirits and demons. There was a guy, much older than all of us, who cried when I started screaming, "Satan, this guy's body will host your spirit in 10, 9, 8, 7... countdown," which was pretty funny. Anyways, there is this expression in Greece, like my mother says, "Mary be with you." So, late in the morning, as we were standing up and about to part our ways, I said, "Good night, guys, may Satan be with you." And that's when something slapped me really hard. I turned around to slap my friend, thinking he was the one who did it. Nope, he was a couple of meters away from me. Then a second slap. Then many sleepless nights and me shutting up ever since. I can imagine how scary it must have been to get slapped by something you couldn't see. No wonder that it left you feeling shaken and unable to sleep. I hope that you have been able to move on from this experience, and that it serves as a reminder to always be mindful of the energy we bring into the world. Story 10. My grandmother's entire life, she had a recurring nightmare. In this nightmare, she would be walking down a long, dark hallway, turn to the left, open a door, and see something terrible. She'd always wake up before seeing what it was. In her 40s, she, her husband, my dad, and my aunt were on vacation. They booked the hotel at the last minute, so they ended up having to get 2 rooms with 2 twin beds on opposite sides of the floor. My dad wakes up around 3 a.m. and can automatically tell something's not right. He calls out in the darkness, "Dad?" No response. He turns on the bedside light. "Dad?" he says, a little louder this time. Still no response. Getting worried, he slides out of bed and shakes his father. He doesn't wake up. My dad ran down the hotel hallway to my grandma's room and started banging on the door. My grandma anxiously opens the door and my dad shouts, "Something's wrong with Dad." He leads her down the hallway, a long hallway, to the last door on the left. My grandmother reaches the door, turns to the left, and sees her husband dead in bed, heart attack. Story 11. I have a couple of stories, but this one always gets me. When I was around 7, my grandmother took care of a baby whose mother was an alcoholic and drug addict. This woman would bring her child, let's call him John, to my grandmother's house and leave him there for months at a time. Needless to say, our family became very attached and thought of him as part of the family. His mother came in to get him one night and her drunk boyfriend flipped the car. John was in a coma for about 3 or 4 days. One night, my older brother wakes everyone in the house up screaming and crying, saying that John is dead. Once my parents get him calmed down, he tells him that John came into his room crying, saying that he has to leave, that he is scared and wants my brother to come with him. Well, my parents are trying to convince my brother that it was just a dream. The phone rings, and it is my uncle calling from the hospital to inform us that John had died. This happened over 30 years ago, but I still get goosebumps thinking about it. Story 12. When I was about 11, some friends and I were having a slumber party, and we all snuck out of the house in the middle of the night and went to a park about half a block away. We had been there for at least an hour or so when I thought I saw a large shadowy figure, about 100 feet away, lurking in the shadows under some trees. We all turned to look and stared in the shadow's direction for about 5 minutes, trying to make it out. Right about when we had decided we were seeing things, the figure started running at us, top speed. We jumped up and ran back to the house as fast as we could go and locked the door. We could hear someone moving around the outside of the house, and then it began tapping on the windows. We couldn't wake anyone up since we would have had to admit that we snuck out. We spent the night huddled together in the middle of the living room, waiting to be murdered. Luckily, we weren't. Isn't this a classic case of kids do something stupid and almost get themselves killed? I mean, we've all been there, right? Sneaking out in the middle of the night to go hang out at the park, thinking we're all cool and stuff. But this group of kids got a bit more than they bargained for when they encountered a shadowy figure lurking in the trees. But hey, at least they learned their lesson, right? Sneaking out in the middle of the night is a bad idea, folks. Just stay home and watch some Netflix or something. It's much safer. Story 13. I had nightmares or woke up scared of something almost every night when I was like 5 or 6. Then it suddenly stopped. I was talking to my mom a year later, and she told me that she sprayed holy water around my room, and then they stopped. She was dead serious. It still freaks me out. Edit. I seriously don't want to edit this because I love everyone's stories about holy water in a Windex bottle, and oddly how most of this became a discussion of Half-Life 3. But no, there wasn't a Windex bottle. She just tossed some holy water around. Would have updated earlier because it took off, but I was on vacation. Story 14. A friend of mine told me when she was 13, she and her friend were at the mall and an older guy, 40 plus, started chatting them up and offered to buy them clothes. The girls went along, and he bought them each about $100 worth of stuff. Then he wanted them to go back to his place to show him the clothes, and the girls ditched him. Hate to think what his plans were to recoup his investment. Story 15. In my hometown, there was a true story about a guy in my neighborhood that was going into people's homes and stealing stuff and killing pets. He made one strike a night, and he was super careful, so he never got caught. Unlike the 9th or 10th night they caught this guy, and he was my neighbor. He was 17 years old, and he did it for the thrill. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.